Now, for those of you that are new, we've been in a series the last few weeks, and we'll be in this series for the next month and a half or so, working through, just going through the book of Joshua, because I believe that there's a lot that we can learn. Because what God did for his people then, here's the good news, God can still do for his people now. What I think is good for us to remember is that what we read in the Bible, when we read about God in the Old Testament or the New Testament, we're not reading about a person who existed then and is not the same today. We serve a God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which gives us great confidence. So let me just to get a little perspective of who I'm talking to, how many of you would say that there's a situation in your life that right now you don't have the answer for? Outside of God, you can't see how this thing's gonna work out. Just indicate with an upraised hand, okay? Like there's a situation I don't have an answer for. Okay. God knows what's behind all of those hands. I wanna talk to those of us that have been there, are there, or next week are gonna be there. Because I believe there's something that we can learn here. And so just to give you a little context, in Joshua chapter 1, we looked at the fact that the Lord showed up to Joshua. Two things happened. First of all, he gave him a mission. He said in verse 2, he said, "Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving to them, to the people of Israel." Now, when he said that to Joshua, this land, though Joshua hadn't dwelt there, he hadn't fought there, he'd been there in terms of, he'd been one of the 12 spies that years prior, 40 years ago, had been in the land, and here's what he knew. When he received this mission, he knew that there were gonna be giants, there were gonna be battles, there were gonna be obstacles, there were gonna be tests of faith. Which is why the Lord didn't stop by just giving him a mission. The Lord also gave him this assurance. Look at verse 5. He said, "No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them." In other words, he was saying, I'm gonna be with you. It doesn't matter what you're gonna face, it doesn't matter what you're gonna walk through. I'm not going anywhere. Now real quick, time out. I'm already getting off the script. If you're here and you raised your hand and you're a child of God, I want you to know that what he said to Joshua is true in your situation. God is with you. He's a friend that sticks close to a brother. He's not going anywhere. Doesn't mean there aren't gonna be giants. Doesn't mean there aren't gonna be obstacles. Doesn't mean there aren't gonna be tests to your faith. Here's what you need to know. Be strong and courageous, for God is with you. The same God that was with the 3 Hebrew children in the fire, the same God that we see faithful and making this commitment to the Israelites is the same God who's going to be with you in your situation. If you read through the rest of Joshua chapter 1, it summarizes him taking over officially as commander of Israel's armies. And his first order of business was this. Through his chiefs, he sent out a message to all the people of Israel. He said, in 3 days, we're moving out, crossing the Jordan River. I want you to start making preparations to leave. Now, when they would have received this information, perhaps a question would have been asked, are you sure that now is the time to go? There's a lot of times that God says, I want you to move out, and you're like, God, are you sure now is the time to go? In fact, let's see the picture here. We got a map here. When they would have made their way, when the Lord appeared to Joshua, it's right there where the yellow line begins. He takes them, they're making preparations to leave. What they would have known when he said, make preparation, is that the Jordan River, and it looks like this little tiny river, that little blue line coming down through there. Doesn't seem to be much of that big of a deal. Well, here was the deal. Back in those days, it was 60 yards across the river, but it happened to be flood season. This was the timing. In fact, if you look at Joshua 3:15, it lets us know it's flood season, which means that it's not just 60 yards across. From what I understand, it would have been about 120 yards across, that the depth of the water at the place that they're crossing to go across there to Jericho would have been right around 12 to 15 foot deep. But God said, I want you to let me take care of this. Joshua's responsibility was not to argue. It wasn't to question. Not to ask for more time, not say, God, are you sure about this? Literally, Joshua's responsibility was to go. His responsibility was to obey. And so what does he do? He gets the people ready to go. So we looked at chapter 2 last week, which is kind of a story within the story. In the 3 days of preparation, there's some advanced planning that's going on. The spies go to Jericho. We looked at that last week. We get to chapter 3, and it picks up where chapter 1 ends. Look at verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. So what's significant about this? Well, the Ark of the Covenant, I've got a picture here just so you get a grasp of this. The Ark of the Covenant was something to symbolize the presence of God. And so when it said that the Ark of the Covenant was going to go before, this actually represented the fact that it was God himself who was going before. So again, let's go back to whatever it was that you raised your hand about, the situation you're facing, okay? You're going, to use the language here in verse 4, you've not passed this way before. You don't know what to expect. You don't know what's ahead of you. There's something significant that takes place. This ark symbolizing the presence of God. When the priest stepped into the water, when they put their feet into the flood, all of the people who were watching, they're standing behind, they knew that it was God who was going before them. They were not going to a place that God hadn't been. Which is good for us today to be reminded of this, because I don't know what your upraised hand is signifying. But though you don't know where you're going, you are not going to a place that God has not already been. God has already inhabited the future that you're getting ready to walk into. You're like, that blows my mind. I get it. But this is our great confidence. And so we continue to read here, verse 14. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks at the time of harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Seraphim. And those flowing down toward the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. And the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Now I want you to go back to the map. If you could go ahead and pull the map back up, because I think this is a significant thing. You see Adam all the way up there. That's where the water stopped. This was no small thing. Just to give you a little perspective of distance. So you see where if you go down south, just a tiny bit southwest of Jericho, you have Jerusalem. That's 17 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho. Like you drop about 3,600 feet in elevation. Jerusalem's on a hill. It's a city on a hill. It drops down to Jericho. Jericho's on a plain. And so to give you perspective, that's 20 plus miles where God stopped the water. And by the way, can I just say something? That the city of Adam, those people that lived there had a story to tell. They're like, something is going on. Like, we just got Niagara Falls and we don't have Niagara Falls. I don't know what's going on here. And by the way, that's what God does usually when you follow God faithfully, it's not just that what he's doing increases your faith. Usually what you're doing is something he uses to bring faith to someone else. They cross the river. They get on the other side, and here's what you got to understand, man. Every single one of them had to walk by the Ark of the Covenant, had to go around it. They couldn't get near it. They had to go around it. But they could not miss the fact it was God that had gone before them. It was God who was in the midst of them. It was God who was for them. This was not their story. It was a God story. And there had to be more to the story because, like, if you know anything about what took place when the Israelites left Egypt, and they come to the Red Sea, the Egyptian army's behind them. They're scared to death. They're like, it'd been better if we'd never left. And God does the first miracle of parting the Red Sea, and they walk through on dry ground. You can't miss the similarity between what we're having here. In fact, I don't think it's any accident that God put these two situations and made them as similar as they are. It's the same God, same power, same promise, using the same method, but there are some differences here. Because this time, they're not crossing looking back in desperation at what's behind them. They're literally crossing in anticipation of what God has ahead of them. As they're crossing into the promised land, they knew, because they had heard the stories of what God had done to part the Red Sea. They're seeing it for themselves, and this is a new day. You see, it was their parents and their grandparents. They were marked by failure, but they were destined for victory. God is going to give us this land. And like, I really would like to just stay there. There's just so much that I'd like to break down there, but there's something unique that happens as we go into chapter 4. After the Israelites had passed over to the other side, the priests are still standing in the middle of the Jordan holding the Ark of the Covenant. God tells Joshua to have a representative from each of Israel's 12 tribes do something unique. He commanded them to pick up a stone out of the riverbed that was close by to where the priests were holding the ark. And these weren't like pebbles. These would have been pretty major stones. And the purpose of this, he gives us in Joshua chapter 4, verse 7. He said, this is to be a memorial forever. This is to make sure that you don't forget what I've done. I don't want you to forget what took place at this spot. I don't want you to forget what God's done. You see, monuments, memorials, like they serve a purpose. Like there's something significant. Like we have all kinds of different memorials. Like probably one of the most common would be like a gravestone. You know, you see a gravestone, like we got a picture there. That, you know, they have the name, the dates, and we memorialize someone. We remember them. But then we have other monuments. Let's go to the next picture. What's this? You know what this is? Liberty Bell. What's this represent? It's a memorial to freedom. We don't forget the freedom that we have as Americans. What about the next picture? What's this represent? Well, there's more. This, it's original. The reason it was originally given was to stand as a memorial to the friendship between France and the United States. Now, across the years, it's come to mean much more than that, but that's what it was intended for. Go to the next picture. I think I look pretty close to Abraham Lincoln. We were trying our best back in the day to make this happen. Mount Rushmore, what's it a memorial to? Four of the greatest U.S. presidents. Like we have these memorials. I was thinking about this. I got a picture of Cole. Like we had quizzing yesterday, and I remember when Cole was in quizzing, and he was holding his trophies, and he was so proud. In fact, like when after he'd finished collecting all these, he had trophies everywhere. I'm like, dude, like honestly, you can probably get rid of some. No, those are my trophies. Like you look to them, you don't remember. I studied hard for that. Anybody remember, I think I've asked this before. When I first moved how many of you have lived in Nampa for years? Let me see your hands. Okay. Any of you guys remember driving down Midland and there was a house that had a big picture window with all kinds of trophies in the window? Anybody remember that? I remember, we're talking dozens of trophies. And they never had blinds, they never had curtains. All you saw was a picture window filled with trophies. And every time I drive by, I'm like, dude, I know there's a story behind that. I would tell Lori constantly, man, someday I'm just gonna stop and I'm gonna go knock on the door and say, what's the story behind the trophies? And I never did it. And every time Lori's like, would you just do it so you can quit talking about the trophy? But there was something about every one of those trophies meant something. They were on full display because they helped us remember. You see, monuments trigger memories. And the reason why God had them do this was he wanted them to intentionally remember. In fact, if we keep reading in Joshua chapter 4, verse 20, he says, "In those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he," speaking of Joshua, "said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know. Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea when he dried it up for us until we passed over. So that," here's why, "so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." And here's what I want to do for the next few minutes, however long we have left together. I want to challenge you. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. I got a simple challenge you. I want to challenge you to build a monument or build monuments so that you don't forget what God has done. Because there is a reason why this wasn't just something Joshua said, hey, I think it's a great idea to do. No, God said, I want you to have these men do this. God knew that remembering matters. And I want to talk about, for the next few minutes, 3 reasons why I believe monuments are important when it comes to us moving forward into the future God's given us. Number 1, why are monuments to what God has done so important? Number 1, remembering what God has done in the past increases our faith today. It reminds us to trust him now, because when our memory fails, our faith falters. As we build this trophy room, we remember what God has done. We remember why our confidence is in him. We remember that God is the God who parts Red Seas, that God is the God who parts Jordan rivers, that what God's done yesterday, God can do today. What happens when we build a monument? We remember God's provision. We remember God's presence. We remember God's power. We remember God's promises. We remember what happened when God showed up. Man, I wish I had time to tell you just stories of what's taken place since I've come here to Grace. If you've been to a Meet the Pastors dinner, I've shared a little bit about this there. I had zero plan, zero desire to be a pastor. I didn't have some long seminary background or anything like that. In fact, I still remember, the reason I moved out here in 2004 was I was a worship pastor here at Grace. Worship pastor and youth pastor. And so I left after only a year and a half. I'm touring with a music group. My family's going here. Across the years, I served on the board. I was just another person sitting in the seat. This was my home church. Pastor, that was never on the radar. And I still remember, I was traveling with Liberty. We're in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I had a concert there. I'm walking into Hampton Inn. I get a phone call from the current pastor who's resigning. He said, hey, I'm resigning tonight, and I'm telling the board that they need to hire you to be the next pastor. And I'm like, that is a terrible idea. And what he told next really bolstered my faith. He said, they don't have any other options. Great. Long story of how God led me here. Some of you have heard this. When we came here, I preached my first message. It was brutal. And apparently not just for me. We lost 20% that never came back after my first message. The first 2 weeks I was here as pastor, literally, 75% of at that time, our ministry volunteer leaders resigned. And they all said, Keith, it's not you. And here's the thing, I believe them like here, but here, sure felt like it was me. And then we're getting ready to have our first board meeting, second Tuesday in August. I meet with our treasurer at the time, and I said, honestly, I haven't even seen the financials. I didn't think about asking that in the interview process. He's like, well, they're not good. So we have $250,000 of debt. We got $4,000 in the bank. I'm like, well, how much do we have in savings? He goes, no, we have $4,000 in the bank. Dude, I remember walking in my third Sunday here. I was beat up, I was bruised, and I thought, I have missed the will of God. There is no way God would let me go through this. But man, God began to move. God began to show up. We didn't know what to do. We literally had cut it down. We had 3 minutes. We had a youth ministry, we had a kids ministry, and we had greeters, and we had a worship team. I think maybe that was it. Like, we didn't have a men's ministry. We didn't have anything like that. We didn't have leaders. And we just said, okay, we're just going to pray it in. And God just began to send people. I remember in 2012, literally, there were different people were driving by, and they had the same story. This happened like months apart. They were driving by, they'd never gone to church. They heard a voice say, turn in the parking lot and go into that building. They walked in this building, came and sat in a service, and ended up giving their hearts to Jesus Christ. 2 different people. The next year, we had 37 people give their hearts to Jesus Christ and get baptized. That never happened here, like in such a short a time. And it wasn't like there was nothing where we could pat ourselves on the back, look at what we've done. There was none of that. It was like God. In fact, I've held on to a church bulletin. I was just sharing this with our team from the first year that I was here. And in the numbers, you can see that there is no way that Grace Bible Church should be here today, and yet God showed up. And as I pulled out that bulletin and I was sharing it with our staff and we were looking at this, I said multiple times, I said, this right here, I'm never getting rid of this bulletin because this is a reminder of what God can do. And here's the thing. I'm gonna tell you right now, there are things I face every single day that our board faces, that our staff faces. Just like you have the things that you raise your hand that you represent, that you have no idea what's gonna happen outside of God showing up. Dude, I am right there with you. But as I look back and remember what God has done, I remember the fact that just as he was faithful then, he is a God who is faithful now. God's not done. But it's not just to increase our faith here. What we read here, Joshua, when he gave this reason, he said, this monument was also given for the kids. When your kids see this monument, they say, what do these stones mean? Then you tell them what God has done. You tell them how God showed up. You see, the second thing that's so important about a monument to God's faithfulness is retelling God's stories anchors the faith of the next generation. Now listen, parents, grandparents, we have a weighty responsibility of raising our kids and grandkids, right? Like there are days that you're like, I just think I'm terrible at this. Or maybe you're like, they're terrible at being raised. Like you see why in the animal kingdom, some species eat their young. Like you're like, this is terrible. It's more than just you have the weighty responsibility as a parent just to keep them alive. You have the incredible opportunity to pass on faith, to introduce them to a God who showed up for you A God who saved you, transformed you. And I'm gonna tell you, like every single day, parents, we're making a decision as to who's gonna disciple our kids and impact their lives. You're like, well, my kids aren't being discipled. Yeah, they are. They're in T-ball, they're being discipled. Somebody's helping them become a better baseball player. They're wrestling, awesome. Somebody's shown them how to be a better wrestler. Here's my thing, are we as intentional about passing on our faith as we are passing on athletic skill? Are we as intentional about passing on and telling God stories as we are challenging them to make those grades, to get the A honor roll and all that? Nothing wrong with any of those things, as long as in the proper perspective. We have the opportunity to pass on their faith. Listen, your kids, your grandkids need to see monuments. Don't let these trophies get buried in a closet somewhere. Put them in a picture window, for crying out loud. What do these trophies mean? Tell them. Tell them about the sins he's forgiven. Tell them about the chains that he's broken. Tell them about the times he healed your body. Tell them about the times that he provided those paychecks. Tell them about the blessings he's given. Tell them about the prayers God answered. Tell them about his goodness, his mercy, his grace. Tell them those God stories. We're passing on our faith. Faith is not something that magically happens because you bring them to church. Faith just doesn't magically happen because they show up at youth group alone. We have the opportunity to pass on this faith. You heard me share a couple weeks ago about, if you were here, how God just did this incredible miracle and supplied a car. My kids heard that story. I told my kids growing up that story, how God showed up. And I remember when Trey was a freshman in college, he calls me, he was working his tail off to graduate debt-free. And he somehow had miscalculated his payment. And he calls me, he's like, man, I cannot afford my school bill. And he's desperate. And immediately, man, I'm like, hey, bro, listen, don't stress, man. I'm gonna help you come up with a solution. We're gonna do this. I'm gonna make this happen. I'm trying to encourage him. I hang up the phone. And a half hour later, God challenges me. He said, you just stole an opportunity for Trey to develop faith. So a half hour later, I called my son back, and I'm sure he did not like what I said. But I said, actually, Trey, I'm not gonna supply that need. I said, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna pray together for God to show up. I said, give me the number. And he gave me the number, and it was a big number. There's no way my son could come up with that. I said, we're gonna pray. And for the next several weeks, actually, it was a period of several months, we prayed, we saw God's face, and we did not see God move until one day, in the middle of COVID, Trey had to come home from college. He gives me a yell, he's like, Dad, you gotta come in here and check this out. And he has an email. And he had been issued a check for the exact amount that we had been praying for, plus $37. God supplied his need and threw in Panda Express to boot. You know what I'm saying? I was like, that's how God gets things done. And this was the end of, the fall of last year. I got another call from my son. Dude, this one's still fresh. And it's not my story to tell someday. I hope you get to hear Trey's story. But it was another situation. Married, baby on the way, and an unexpected thing takes place. And this time I know for a fact that I can't help him. It's beyond what I can do. It's beyond what he can do. And he's like, Dad, I don't know what to do. You know what we did? I said, let's go back. And we went back to a time when God showed up. I said, I want you to remember what God did your freshman year of college, Trey. I want you to remember what God did. I want you to remember how God showed up. And I said, we're gonna do the exact same thing we did. And man, for months, we prayed and prayed and prayed. And just a few weeks ago, God did a miracle and did exactly what only God could do and met the need in full. Now listen, I tell these stories. What is powerful about this faith? You raise your kids. And we have a family faith. They're under the family umbrella of faith. But there's coming a day when your kids, if you're raising them right, they're gonna walk out your door, they're gonna go to college, they're gonna take that first job, they're gonna get married. And what they need when they walk out that door is not just a family faith. They need a personal faith. And monuments are part of developing that faith. What do these stones mean? Let me tell you a story. Retelling God's stories anchors the faith of the next generation. Oh man, I got so much stuff I want to share. Okay, I got to keep going. The last thing I'll leave with you is this. Why does this matter? Recounting what God has done in the past ultimately reveals how great God truly is. We're reminded that what seems today to be the impossible situation, what today is that mountain that's casting a shadow over our lives that literally when we go to bed, it wakes us up in the middle of the night and we're like, how can I get past this? That thing that throughout the day, our mind just can't help but go there. We get distracted. We start to obsess over this. It's a reminder that God is bigger than whatever it is that we're gonna face. It's a reminder that the size of our problem, as big as it might be, is no match for the size of our God. This is why we have trophies. This is why we put it in a picture window. Our kids need to know how God showed up, what God did. And these monuments, they matter because it points to who God is. In fact, I brought in some things with me today. I'll just pull them out. So I've got this, I've got a bag here. And these are just a few of these things. So in my bookcase, several years ago, I was actually preaching through Joshua. We did something. We brought in a whole dump truck full of rocks. Like we got way too many people be doing this. But on this rock, I wrote, what do these stones mean? I wrote sable. Because I don't want to forget what God did with the mercury sable. I've had more people like, what's that rock on your bookshelf? I'm like, oh, it's pretty cool. Here's what God did. So I keep that. That's one thing. I've got, actually, you know what? I better get up here so you guys can see this because this is actually important. I've got this right here. This is a big deal. This is a pill box. It has a bunch of pennies inside. So the significance of this, when in 2013, God was beginning to send people here. People were getting saved and we were growing. We had to do something. Like, I guess we're gonna have to do a renovation here. And honestly, it was a big step of faith for the board. Like, we didn't have, at least to our knowledge, the money to do this. And so we stepped out in faith. And so I'd shared with our church, I literally shared with Grace kids. I said, man, I believe in the power of a praying kid. I said, kids, I want you to pray about this. And in our fourth, I think it was our 4-year-old class, they asked their teacher if they could be part of this. And the Sunday after I told them this, they all brought in pennies, and this is the very first offering I got for our Jericho project. Dude, I'm gonna tell you right now, this is holy to me. Like this, like I keep that right there as a reminder of how God showed up and what God did in that situation. I've got other thing. I can't tell these stories. You know what? Actually, show the picture of Kenya. I've got this picture, but it's easier just to show it so everybody can see it on the screen. This is a picture that's really important to me. When I was in Kenya in 2019, Pastor Jason, who's at Middleton Grace on the far right, I'm on the left. We were there. We didn't know anything about Missions of Hope International, but they had stopped by a field and said that they wanted to pray over this field. And while we were praying, I literally, as clear as I've ever had God say anything, said Grace Bible Church is supposed to build a school here, and there was nothing there. And I looked at Jason, and Jason looked at me, and he's like, did God tell you the same thing? I'm like, yeah. So I asked Mary, I said, how much does it cost to build a school? She asked somebody for numbers. She's like, I think it's around $10,000 US. And so I'm like, well, if I got to do it myself, I feel so strongly we're going to build a school. So I came home and got up and told our church that, man, we're not going to take an offering, but if you want to give, I just felt like God wanted us to be part of this. And I said it's going to be about $10,000. And I got done and went back to my seat. and picked up my phone, and they said, hey, we got the numbers wrong. I don't know where that number came from. That's more like $40,000. I'm like, oh, well, it is what it is. In 1 week's time, we got $41,000 that came in, and God built a school. Now we got hundreds of kids that are actually over there, like hearing the gospel, lives being transformed, build a high school. I have different things that I could show you. Here's the thing I just want to come back to. Monuments matter. Because I know that as we go into this new year, there are some of you, you're on the precipice of something new. New job, new dream. God has something for you. And even though there's an excitement over the new, there's fear over what you don't know. Monuments remind us that God's already been where we're going. Monuments remind us that just as God was faithful then, he's going to be faithful today. Some of you are actually going through a season of loss. Maybe it's you've lost someone close to you. You've lost your job. Maybe you've lost a marriage. You've lost your health. You're going through a season of loss or dramatic change. You didn't see this coming and you're anxious and fearful, wondering what's around the corner. What do these stones mean? They remind us that God sees you, that God's with you, that there's never going to be a road you're going to take that God isn't walking with you. What do these stones mean? It reminds us that God is faithful. And so what I would say, church, is before we take the steps into what God is asking us to, before we raise the sword and begin to fight, before we take the land that God has already given to us, I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is to stop and build a monument so that as we take that journey, we can look back and remember God's faithfulness. So here's my homework. It's very simple. If you're here and you're a Christian, I want you to remember at least one story this week. One thing from the past in which God showed up, God did a miracle. And what I want you to do is in a place, like I have friends that have a shadow box that they put right on the wall by their table, so they have different things there. So when they're sitting at the table, they can remind their kids of things that they've seen God do. Or maybe it's just something you put on a bookshelf, something you hang on a wall. Maybe it's nothing more than a yellow sticky note that you put on your mirror so you see it every morning when you're getting ready. I want you to build a monument. Remember what God has done. And when your kids ask, what do these stones mean? Tell them. And God, as we do so, may you receive the glory. May our kids' faith be built up. And Father, may you give us the confidence to say yes and to obey, even when we don't see totally where it is that you're taking us. And so God, I pray over every hand that was raised that is facing a situation that is bigger than they are, in which they need to see you move. God, would you do a miracle? Would you provide? But God, I'm praying even before we see your provision in this moment, that we would remember and build a monument to what you've done before, so that until we see you show up and we have the chance to build another monument, that we can remember just as you were faithful before, so will you be faithful today. So God, it's because you're good, it's because you're great, it's because you're faithful, that we pray these things looking forward to what lies ahead. We can't control the future. We can't put it all together. We don't have all the answers, but we trust that you are large and in charge, and we really do believe the best is yet to come. And so God, would you change us and continue to prepare us for what is coming next? We love you, and we pray these things in the powerful name of Jesus Christ. And all God's people said, amen. You are dismissed. See you next week.